to-do list for the WTO. Thank you. So welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Taking Stock of 2021, a to-do list for the WTO in the circular economy transition. This is a webinar organised by the IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, as well as Finland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the permanent mission of Finland to the WTO. I'm Alice Tipping. I work at the IISD on a number of different sustainable trade issues, and it's my very great pleasure to be the moderator of this afternoon's discussion. I will start with a few boring housekeeping issues. Those of you familiar with Zoom will know this all very well, but I would ask you to all please keep yourselves on mute unless you're taking the floor, just to avoid any background disturbance. Feel free to keep your videos on if your bandwidth allows, and a special request perhaps to our speakers to keep your videos on as well, precisely because what I'm about to do is stop sharing my own screen, which means that it's quite nice to have a number of different faces up on the screen when you're speaking. So thanks to all of you for joining us. Please be aware, everyone, that we are recording this session and that this recording is going to be made available on IISD's website, and that includes both the presentations and the questions and answers at the end and the discussion. So just so you're aware, that's how the recording is going to be used. You'll see at the bottom of your box, as usual, you have a chat and you have a Q&A box. We're going to be focusing on the Q&A box today. So if you have questions or comments as the presenters make their presentations, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A box. I'll be keeping an eye on it as moderator, as will a couple of my colleagues. And what that means is that once we have gone through the first round of interventions and we have a little bit of time for some interaction and some responses, I'll be able to pick some of the most interesting questions from the Q&A box and put them to our different speakers. And so before I introduce my speakers, I thought it might be helpful just to, I suppose, to kind of frame our discussion slightly, right? To remind ourselves of why the circular economy is such an important question to be talking about, and essentially why we're running this particular webinar on this particular date. So many of you who follow trade policy and the circular economy will know that these two concepts are closely interlinked, right? And the two areas of policy are actually strongly mutually supportive. So trade can work as an enabler as climate change and unsustainable consumption of natural resources can persist. A transition to a circular economy, I think many governments are realizing, is a necessity. But it's a necessity, but it's also an opportunity, right, to transform economies to a more sustainable model of production and consumption. And as with most economic policies, trade and trade rules can play, we think, a key role in facilitating and enabling this transition. So if they'll allow me to speak on their behalf, I should say that the permanent mission of Finland to the WTO has, over the last few months, and together with a range of partners, including us, hosted a series of webinars focused on this intersection between circular economy and trade. The previous discussions have covered a number of different issues. They've covered services trade, development and aid for trade, the role of trade in the circular economy from the business community's perspective, the role of regional and cross-sectoral cooperation, and in fact, the interlinkages between trade and finance policies, in particular in facilitating this transition to a circular economy in the context of recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, which many of us probably feel we are in the middle of still. So work at the WTO has taken, I think, a new lease of life in the last few years. It's suffice to say the circular economy as a concept is already part of the standard discussion at the WTO, and that's happened really just over the last few years. So what's interesting, I think, is that even though the concept is now relatively well understood, it's clear that we're going to need some quite concrete discussions starting next year on how to understand the various perspectives, the trade-related aspects of the circular economy, and how trade can help to enable this transition. So today we have a chance to look back a bit on 2021 and to look forward to 2022, and to do that with a really interesting panel of experts who have a very interesting range of perspectives on trade and the circular economy, and specifically on what the role of the WTO could be in advancing and enabling this transition, which is so crucial for sustainable development. So we have on our panel, we have Aiko Lim, who's the Director of the Division on Trade and Environment at the WTO. Thanks for joining us, Aiko. We should soon have Etienne Kechechian, who is a Senior Private Sector Development Specialist at the World Bank, who I'm conscious is joining us from Washington, so the time may be a challenge. We have Carolina Rasi, who is a specialist at the Confederation of Finnish Industries. So thank you, Carolina, for joining us. We have Bezawit Eshutu from the African Circular Economy Network. And Bezawit, I had the pleasure of having her on a panel when we spoke about the circular economy and services trade. So thanks, Bezawit, for joining us again. And we have my former colleague and great friend, Christoph Bellman, who now works at the Trade and Environmental Sustainability outfit in the Graduate Institute, where he is the head of policy analysis and strategy. So thanks very much, Christoph, indeed, for joining us. So what we're going to do today is to have a series of, essentially it's sort of a conversation with these experts. We're going to have a range of initial interventions from them. I do have some follow-up questions, but those are really just to be kept up my sleeve. I'd love to put to them any unexpected questions that come up in the Q&A. They'll be able to see them coming, of course, because they'll see the Q&A box too. But that's what we'll do. We'll have an initial conversation with them. We'll have some follow-ups. They'll have, of course, the ability to respond to interesting things they find other people have said. And then we'll have some time to draw in questions and comments from the audience. And that should take us very safely, I think, through 90 minutes or so. So firstly, perhaps, Aiko, I might turn to you. I feel like I'm on a webinar with you at least every couple of days, which I think is testament to just how central the environment debate has become at the WTO, that you're required to talk about it so publicly and so frequently. So I might perhaps ask you to give us a few sort of opening remarks and to kind of help to set the scene about how the circular economy as a concept has come to live in the WTO. So go ahead, please.
Yes, thanks so much, Alice. Yes, it's true. We do find ourselves on webinars very frequently, but they're always very interesting webinars and very well moderated by you. So a great pleasure for me to join this. As usual, my thanks really to the Finnish delegation, to IISD for putting this together. I do have to say a special thanks to Marit Kaitanen, although you don't see her on the screen. She's really, I think, the person who's really been motivating a lot of this discussion. I still remember when Marit came to see me only some 2 years ago, and she was at that time tentatively proposing an activity on circular economy. And at that time, I must admit, I knew very little about circular economy. I still have a lot to learn, but I knew very little then. And I think, through her, through the Finnish delegation, through IISD and many others, you've really taken this conversation forward and really made a very important contribution to the discussions on trade and environment at the WTO. And it's really taken root, if I can say so, and I'll speak a little bit more about some of the things that are happening today, a little bit things that happened already, and maybe a little bit on, as you were saying, Alice, things to think about going forward in 2022. Most of you, or if not all of you, are circular economy specialists, so I don't need to talk so much about the background. Maybe just to make the point that, what is the challenge between circular economy and trade, and also what is the opportunity? Of course, trade is based upon our economies, it's based upon how we consume and how we produce. And for the most part of it, that consumption and that production is based on a linear model. And so not surprisingly, trade is also going to be taking a somewhat of a linear approach when we think about value chains, both value chains for goods and services, taking things from production to the consumer, as well as reverse supply chains, which should really come back into the circular economy, but unfortunately, more often than not, they don't really work like that. So that's the challenge, to try to make trade itself more circular. So therefore mirroring, or if not mirroring, actually contributing to the circular economy. So you've got these two models out there. And I think it is possible. It's not necessarily going to be easy, but it's certainly possible. And there are really some very clear sort of points of connection between circular economy and trade, and the linear, and how do we convert this linear model to a more circular model. It involves both goods and services, because we're not talking about just moving goods. We're also talking about the services that are required around the circular economy and also in the design of the goods themselves, as well as what happens at the end of life of that good. So the whole range of things from design to refurbishment, repair, remanufacturing, recycling, and so forth. So how does it link to international trade? Now, of course, this webinar and many, many other webinars before have all tried to understand this question. And I think we are making some progress. I mean, I think there's still quite a lot to understand and learn. Some very basic things that I think has become increasingly evident, which is that, you know, for circular economy to make that big difference, which you talked about, Alice, it needs to be scaled up. So how do we scale up? International trade is an instrument for doing this. I mean, it's in fact, that's what it's about. A lot of things that happen in trade is about economies of scale. And to create that economy of scale, we need countries, as well as the private sector, to factor this into the way they design trade policy, as well as their business strategies and their products, and as well as to factoring into how they sell services and goods to consumers. So some of this can be done at WTO. Some of it is going to be done outside of WTO. And some of it, you know, will require the private sector. In fact, all of it requires the private sector, because it's the private sector that's actually the one producing, distributing, recycling, remanufacturing, and so forth. And that's the normal landscape, you know, for any issue at WTO. It's not just one organization. It's how all of these organizations come together and how they work together, as well as all the members and stakeholders that I've mentioned. So here, maybe fast forward a little bit to what's actually happening. So, and how do we develop this cooperation and collaboration that I've been speaking about? You have the Committee on Trade and Environment. That's essentially one big contribution from the WTO, if I can say, WTO members, by creating this committee. It is the committee that's meant to try to bring together trade and environmental policies, and to also iron out any difficulties and challenges in that context. At the same time, we have the 3 new initiatives that have come forward and which will be launched next week. They already launched in essence, because the ministerial statements are already issued, but the members will be having an event, and that event is on 15 December in the morning. And so it will be the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability, the informal dialogue on plastics pollution, and there's also the statement on fossil fuel subsidy reform. These initiatives, coupled with the work at the CTE, and I should also mention another committee actually that has been also in a way, I think, going to be quite critical to circular economy, which is the Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade, the TBT committee. It's not a committee that's about environmental sustainability per se, but a lot of what it does will have an implication and will have a relationship to it. And why do I say so? Because, you know, when we look at circular economy, when we think about what are we actually talking about concretely, we're talking about, from a governmental perspective, national measures, you know, talking about standards, technical regulations. These are things that fall under WTO agreements, and they're notified to the WTO. We know that at the moment we have close to something like 450 related notifications on issues that relate to the circular economy. This goes from waste management, recycling, eco-design standards, also circular economy standards, conformity assessment standards, extended producer responsibility, and so forth. So my expectation is that there will be a lot more in this area of TBT and the circular economy. And it's going to be critical to develop the right standards, the types of regulatory cooperation that will lead to reducing friction rather than increasing friction, enabling developing countries to have the capacity to engage in the circular economy, but be very concrete and think about, when we talk about capacity, what actually makes a difference. And I think it's not capacity in general, but it's going to be capacity drilling down to elements that can really help either governments have stronger enforcement, monitoring, regulatory frameworks or institutions. It's their businesses to be able to deal with conformity assessment in a positive way. It's about their consumers appreciating what is the difference between a circular economy product and service versus a non-circular economy product and service. And why does that matter in relation to costs? But there are things like this to be thinking about. Very lastly, since it's, you asked a bit about looking forward, some of it I've already talked about, just 5 specific points to think about. Some of this is about classification. How do we distinguish between waste and reusable materials? What types of definitions are required for this? How to work with the harmonized system and the World Customs Organization on doing this. I've spoken already about standards and technical requirements, so I'll drop that. A third one on rare traditional WTO areas, but it's about tariffs and other barriers to trade on environmental goods, but maybe be more specific. Environmental goods, what types of goods and services that can help encourage diffusion of circular economy products and technologies. Services is included in that bundle. I've put it as a separate point, but it could be the same point. And the last point is again on the issue of capacity and developing capacity in this area, and to think about how to use aid for trade and all the various vehicles for improving supply side capacity to contribute to the circular economy. So that's my very quick introduction and stock take. I think it's work that will continue, and there does seem to be, trade environment is never an easy area, but I've been impressed by how much interest there is in circular economy and the willingness that people are showing to try to, they may still have differences, but at least to be willing to talk and to think through some of these challenges and how to take them forward. So thanks very much, Alice.
No, thank you very much, Willem. And I think you're actually quite right. When you think about kind of the number of trade and environment issues out there, the circular economy is actually one that attracts a really wide range of support and interest, right, from a number of different members. It's a politically a kind of a unifying concept that I think a wide range of governments can get behind, which is always important, politically speaking. And thanks also for reminding us just how important the work of the regular committees of the WTO is. And it's work that I think can sometimes get a bit overshadowed by kind of brand new statements and sort of the fun stuff that happens next year. But in fact, they're crucial for ensuring that the trade policy measures governments are already using to help to circularize operations or help businesses to circularize their operations are transparent, that there's understanding of them, and that discussion can help to minimize friction that might otherwise occur when governments seek to put in place trade policies to help businesses circularize their work. So let's not forget how important the regular committees are, right, in the context of things the WTO can do. But precisely on the topic of the private sector, Willem was talking about just how important the role of businesses is in rethinking their own operations, as well as what they would require of policy to help them to circularize their own production and consumption of the goods that they produce. So that's probably the perfect moment to bring you in, Carolina. You work at the Confederation of Finnish Industries. Can you tell us a little bit of how you see the role of trade in supporting a circular economy transition? Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. So I represent the Finnish Confederation, which groups together 21 different industry sectors in Finland. I'm based in Brussels, so my focus is the EU policy advocacy and following the EU regulation. Out of our 21 different sectors, many are already very focused on circular economy solutions and new technologies and inventions. I will give you a few examples from the textiles and electronic sectors. Now, obviously, you may know that the EU has already issued its second circular economy strategy, which the last one actually lists 35 different legislative initiatives under its the strategy, which will then guide the businesses towards the circular economy. The reason being, obviously, that we are using the natural resources in an unsustainable way. We are using water, land. The amount of waste is almost unbearable. So we have to find solutions to this, and obviously so it's linked to the climate and environmental goals. And for example, something that just recently came out from the Commission, the battery regulation actually regulates both what must be the percentage of the content of the recycled content in the end product, and also the recycling targets. So the example in Finland that what we have done and are doing to respond to this challenge, but also obviously, so it's both kind of pushed with the regulation, but also obviously there must be some kind of business logic. The challenge is that we need to engage the consumers and inspire them to jump on board, because the products are more expensive. I mean, you have this is unfortunately the truth. Now, when it comes to waste, electrical and electronic equipment, only 20% of that is globally recycled currently. But we're talking about, especially I mentioned the batteries, we're talking about rare earth metals, scarce metals that we only recycle 11% of the precious metals currently used in batteries, for example. But the challenge here is that we are obviously, when you look at from the EU side, we're dependent on the rare earth metals coming from outside the EU. So that's kind of one reason that we need to kind of balance this situation. There is already battery production in Europe, for example. So one of the main potential sources for the raw materials is waste electrical electronic equipment. And in fact, in Finland, there will be something called urban mining plant, which will become operational 2024, which eventually can actually deal with 30% of laptop phone circuits, which then can be recycled. So that's a big thing. The second, and then there's obviously there will be an ecosystem surround this. So there's a plant, but then there's also a service company who will take care of this. So they will actually collect and recycle the equipment on behalf of more than 1,000 companies in Finland. Now, kind of there's a problem currently with this also, which is a global problem, because 80% of the waste is currently sent outside EU, so to non-EU countries, but it's basically landfilled. So then this is not sustainable. So we have to answer this problem as well. Another example is the textile sector, where only 1% of the textile waste globally is actually recycled to become new, again, clothes. It's recycled to something else, maybe 10%, but it's very low. So that's something that Finland is trying to answer, at least at the EU level. The thing is, the markets are very small. So Finland has currently, there's also a textile recycling plant that was recently opened, which can also recycle, again, 30% of the EU textile waste. But of course, Finland is a small market, so then I guess the trade comes into picture. We need the secondary raw material, obviously, to be transported to to Finland, every second one truckload filled with textile waste is either burned or landfilled. So this is another reason why we need to answer to that problem. I have listed kind of 4 points, which the bottlenecks that we still have, because we actually have bottlenecks within the EU, but then clearly we have bottlenecks, globally. But within the EU, we must genuinely ensure that an internal market is created for the recycling raw materials, because this is the problem. They are considered as waste, and there's different definitions for waste or byproduct, even in the 27 different member states. So that's not harmonized. Then we're waiting for a new waste shipment regulation to be issued soon, because that will then harmonize the transport, selling, and process of this secondary raw material / waste. And we are still facing administrative burdens even within the internal market. So within the 27 member states, there's different kind of notifications concerning waste for obvious reasons, because when it's waste, then it can be also dangerous or poisonous or whatever. So of course there must be high regulation there, but that is a bottleneck currently. And then the 4th is actually the illegally dumped waste outside of the EU. We know that plastics, textiles, electronics are unfortunately moved out of the EU to Africa, for example, where obviously there's no way they can handle the waste sustainably, because we can't even do it necessarily in Europe yet, because it's kind of, I want to say early days, but it's not. Yeah, in a way it's early days. We have all these initiatives and new technologies and inventions in the pipeline, but I think we still have some time to go there. So I guess that would be my comments from the EU point of view.
No, thank you, Carolina. That was fascinating, and I was taking notes just to make sure I captured it all, because it's really interesting. I mean, even starting from this question that it's partly out of environmental concern, and it's partly a strategic question of ensuring security of supply for things like raw materials. I mean, that gives it that sort of puts us in a different geopolitical dimension, but very interesting. And from some of the bottlenecks, I mean, we often look to the EU as being kind of one of the most advanced of all the kind of regulatory systems, and it's fascinating to hear that that it's still trying to work out how to harmonize its own systems to enable this kind of circularity and recycling. And it almost sort of sounds like there's lots of ideas there, but what you actually need is a market at scale to make it not just kind of good for Finland in the scale of Finland, but actually kind of useful at an EU scale and therefore bigger. So that's really fascinating, and hopefully we get a bit of time to come back to that in the discussion, but thank you. Those are really interesting points. So perhaps we'll move from the EU to Africa at this point, and this is the point where I can bring you in, Bezoit. I mean, I can remember talking to you about this at the last event that we ran, but it's clear to many of us Africa and Africans have been using circular economy principles for generations, right? And it would be interesting, I guess, to see from your perspective what the role of trade could be in helping to advance sort of the circular economy transition, particularly in developing countries that may not have the luxury of the time and human resources and financing that EU governments have. But what does it look like from your perspective? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Alice. So as you already introduced me, I'm Beza. I'm here representing the African Circular Economy Network. It's a Pan-African organization, non-profit organization trying to promote and create awareness across the continent on circular economy concepts and principles. So coming to your question, looking at the bigger picture, what actually drives the market and the trade transactions taking place globally in the 21st century, I can boldly say that two things are coming out very clearly. One is the behavioral change of consumers. Consumers are now asking or demanding for sustainably produced products and services. not only in the developed nations, but somehow also in the developing nations also. So for African manufacturers, producers, whether small and medium enterprises or industry parks, whichever capacity they are categorized in, at the end of the day, they're producing goods and services to be sold to make profit. So for them to fit into the global value chain, let alone in their own respective countries or within the African continent, they have to consider that drive of consumer change of sustainability. That's also followed by, obviously, they need to make it as profit margin high as possible. For that to happen, they have to be producing things in a cost minimized way, and those things are actually causing them to shift into considering circularity. They can use concepts, circular ideas and concepts to make sure that they are competent in the global market and also within their profit margin level, I would say. And the other thing is selling finished products, or at least semi-finished products globally, is more profitable than exporting raw material as it is outside the continent. That's the trend in Africa for obvious reasons. There is lack of capacity in manufacturing sector, infrastructure, finance. A lot of things are hindering that process of exporting semi-processed and finalized goods. But circularity can bring into the picture of modular products. They can produce parts and parcels of products that can fit into one big, say, for example, if we take an electronics, they can produce parts and parcels which are in line with circular concepts, which can be used across the continent which can be assembled across the continent in a circular way and sold as that, and they can ask, or they can get a premium incentive price. So that's something that circularity can also bring into picture. The other one is, it has already been mentioned by Madam Carolina. Africa is the go-to destination for secondary goods and products. And when they come on this side of the continent, obviously the capacity to process especially hazardous complex materials is very limited. The solid waste management sector is not yet full capacity to process those wastes and then either reuse them or scavenge them or even refurbish and recycle them. So for that reason, circularity can also be a place where the trade for products which are going to be dismantled can be a place to go to. Those are the key things that are happening when we talk about trade going from the African continent to the other side of the globe. And most importantly, I would say the thing that is emerging these days is trade negotiations across the continent, like African Continental Free Trade Agreements. So those kind of continental coalitions, I would say, discussions and proceedings, deliberations lead to the fact that we can access a 1.2, 1.3 billion market niche in the continent, within the continent itself. So circularity can also support that angle, that perspective of trade agreements across the continent. That is what I can reflect. Thank you. Back to you, Ali.
No, thanks, Beza. That's really interesting. Maybe and I'm so pleased you touched on the regional trade aspect at the very end, because I think in a lot of kind of abstract trade policy discussion, particularly about African trade, there's such a focus on ensuring that there's more regional trade, right? That it's not just Africa exporting raw materials somewhere else for profit, that there's a lot more regional trade within African countries. And we'll come to this at the end, but if you had any examples of how that intra-African trade is starting to reflect more circularity already, maybe because consumers in another African country are demanding more sustainable products, that would be really interesting. So I'll leave you with that question just in case you can think of any examples. If you can't, that's fine, but I'd be really curious and wanted to get it out there. Okay, super. Well, perhaps let's, just to sort of finish off the initial round of interventions, I might turn next to you, Christoph, from the TESS group at the Graduate Institute. You're one of the authors of a report on the circular economy and trade in general. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the genesis of that report and what role you see for the WTO in advancing circular economy efforts. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Alice, and thanks for the invitation. Yes, I was actually part of the main author of this report that was produced by ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, with the University of Adelaide. And I think what is interesting in this this exercise is that the report was based not only on the review of literature but also on a series of interviews with companies, and we try to really understand what are the concerns that they're facing. We started from the assumption that and it's not really an assumption, it's just a reality. If you look at the different business models that today are essential to promote a transition to a circular economy, you will see that all of these business models rely on international trade, whether it's those models that focus on the recycling recovery, models that focus more on the design part of the value chains, those that look at for example, the product life extension by promoting remanufacturing, refurbishing, second-hand goods, and so on. All of these depend in a way or another on international trade, largely for economies of scale. And actually, if you look at what is happening in the world, you see that there is trade in components or aspects of corresponding to all of these value chains. You have trade in waste and scrap. You have trade in secondary raw material, which is growing very fast. You have trade in second-hand goods, trade in goods for remanufacturing, refurbishing. In many cases, we lack precise data, partly because the HS system does not really allow us to understand or to differentiate the goods. But we know that trade is happening, and we also know that there are a number of trade barriers that are affecting trade in this area. I think some have been mentioned. Issues of classifications is really a problem that exists. The fact that we cannot really differentiate between what is waste, what is secondary raw material, what is new products versus goods or second-hand goods. There are trade restrictions in forms of trade bans, mostly for hazardous wastes and largely for good reasons, plastic waste, metal waste. Tariff and rules of origin, there are a few issues here and there. This is not the main issues. Export restrictions are much more problematic and prevalent, particularly on waste and scrap. And then subsidies. Think about fossil fuel subsidies to plastic production that still provide some kind of perverse incentives or delay a transition to a circular economy. And then we have all these regulation standards and conformity assessment procedure that Home mentioned. And here, the main issue is not so much that they exist, but it's more the fact that they're different. There are lots of regulatory heterogeneity among across jurisdictions, and that creates a lot of challenges for companies. I can maybe just give you two examples a little bit from what we've heard from companies. One is in the e-waste sector, particularly the disposal of electrical and electronic equipment, which is something that is growing very fast. I think we're at 53 million tons globally, and this waste contain both very valuable material but also highly toxic substances, and that's why you have, with good reasons, a lot of regulations that affect this. Now, from a private sector perspective, the recycling of e-waste largely relies on international reverse supply chains, which require very large quantities to secure economies of scales and be economically viable. So if you look at the market, there's only a handful of large-scale smelters and refiners that have the capacity to extract metals from e-waste and resell it on the international market, and that makes them extremely vulnerable to limitation on cross-border trade. So we have the Basel Convention, which offers, a set of common reference points. But in practice, we see that the classification of what is hazardous waste, what is not hazardous waste, what is good for destined for reuse, repair, refurbishments really differ from one country to the other, and that of course affects trade, and ultimately this deters investment in recycling capacities. So that's one of the reasons also why I think companies really understand the need to have an international approach or discussion to address this problem. Another example relates to labeling schemes, and particularly the use, for example, of different symbols that indicate recyclability of packaging. This is something that you find in Europe, but in many other cases. And I remember, I think it was the case of IKEA, which was basically telling me that they operate through a franchise system in over 60 different markets. So they have a uniform packaging across all countries, because that allows them to move goods internationally and respond to the national demand instead of producing everything in the country where it's sold, and that avoids overproduction. And I think it's good from a circular economy perspective. So they end up having to put all the different recyclability symbols in one single packaging on each of the good that they send. And that not only creates a lot of confusion, because you end up with 10 different symbols on the product, but also they've realized that many of these requirements in terms of recyclability are sometimes incompatible, and in some cases even contradictory. For example, what one country penalizing or banning what the other country is actually requiring. So you end up in a situation where these differences in this recyclability, the symbols and labeling, forces or end up or generates very high costs for companies, and again that affects their ability to scale up investment in more circular models. So these are just a few cases, a few examples. There are many other cases like this, which illustrate why trade is important, but also why removing some barriers to trade, and they're not necessarily barriers to trade, they just happen to be different regulations in different countries, and they may not even be protectionist, but this lack of interoperability prevents the creation of a global market, and that really affects the ability to generate economies of scale. So I think that's one of the big issues. What can be done? I think we'll leave that for the next round, but I think there's a number of things that can be done, and that has to be done at the national level by the companies themselves, but also that can be done internationally and in the WTO. I'll get back to that maybe later on.
No, super, that's really interesting. And in fact, I was writing down a couple of really dumb questions I had to ask you, and in fact you answered them already. And one was going to be, why does the classification problem matter? Right, and I think the answer that I think I'm hearing is that essentially it means that it's actually very difficult to get your goods, particularly if they're to be recycled, actually makes it very difficult for you to get them through customs if you can't explain very clearly with a specific code to the customs official what it is in your container. And every time you have to go back and forth and get another set of paperwork, it makes it even more difficult, right? It's an obstruction to the movement of stuff that you might want to be able to recycle somewhere. And again, the more difficult it is to move things, the more difficult it is to get scale level recycling going on. And the IKEA example is fascinating. So we very much look forward to the report coming out. In fact, I might stay with you, because I really want to know what's in the report now. I know it isn't public yet, but maybe I could stay with you and ask can you provide us at least a peek into the findings and recommendations of what the WTO might be able to do? And then maybe I'll come back to Carolina to ask you what you think of some of the things that Christoph has come up with in his report and some of the recommendations. Can you give us a peek?
Yes, sure. No, actually, yes, the report is going to be formally launched on Monday, I think, on the 14th.
Okay.
But we have been presenting the findings already in a number of quarters. The reason being that some of the recommendations were actually for the or thinking about the Ministerial Conference. Now the conference has been postponed, but still, I think the recommendations are useful. They focused most specifically one of the and that's what by design the TESSD initiative, so the trade and environment sustainability structure discussion in the WTO in terms of what could be done there. They could apply equally, I think, to the IDP, the informal discussion on plastics, and why not, to the CTE. But the first recommendation was, well, make sure that the circular economy is on the agenda and reflected in the ministerial statements that were going to come out of these initiatives. And that's, give a strong political signals. And we know already that this kind of recommendation has been followed. When we look at what those ministerial statements are talking about, they all make reference, and I think that's quite interesting. The second was, well, start a work program to try to understand what is the relation between circular economy and trade. Bringing in perspectives from different stakeholders, private sectors, different ministries, bring in the Basel Convention, the WTO, foster transparency, notification, explore the interlinkages, and so on and so forth. And there, the idea was really to focus both on the trade policy obstacles that might affect circular economic transition, tariff protection, export restrictions, this type of things, but also the domestic circular economy policies, which may have trade implications. And that's your, how do you design your extended producer responsibility scheme to limit the impact on trade, the standards, the labeling, the quantitative restrictions and bans. So that was the second. And then thinking about what could be possible deliverables or outcomes of these discussions, we came up with three ideas. One, which is probably the more kind of traditional idea, is to integrate or to include circular economy and resource efficiency in an eventual revival of the talks on environmental goods and services. And we made a few suggestions here in terms of how to identify goods which are relevant to the circular economy and services which are relevant to the circular economy. Now, the likelihood of this happening in the short term is relatively limited, and the tariff barriers are not really the biggest problem in this area. But still, that was an interesting, a first recommendation. The second was basically to revive work that has taken place 10 years ago in the WTO, which focused on remanufactured goods. There was an initiative back in 2010, including a draft ministerial decision by Japan, US, and Switzerland, which looked at remanufactured goods. It was focusing on reviewing non-tariff measures, including import licensing, import prohibitions, pre-shipment inspections, technical regulations, a proposal to create a working group on trade in remanufactured goods. They had a definition of what, they proposed a definition of what remanufactured goods there. So I think there's a very pragmatic thing is to see if this work can be revived and maybe extended to other sections. And the third idea, and which I think is probably the most interesting one and the most promising one, is to use the TESSD or the IDP as a forum to start agreeing or defining a set of common principles and best practices, which could be followed by governments in the design of their trade-related circular economy regulatory measures. Because we know that this regulatory heterogeneity is really the biggest challenge for the private sector. The WTO is not going to set the regulations, but what the WTO can do is maybe provide a set of broad principles that governments should follow when they design their EPR schemes or their standards or their quantitative restrictions, to make sure that these measures are designed in a way that is the least trade restrictive possible while still achieving their environmental objectives. And these, of course, will have to be designed in cooperation, ideally, with the private sector and relevant organizations. Should probably focus on the particular sector. It can be single-use plastics, it can be hazardous waste, it can be e-waste, it can be chemicals. But the idea is really to come up with a set of soft law, kind of non-prescriptions in a non-binding nature, which, kind of best practices that not only because it will be much easier to agree, but also because it may be what is most relevant for the type of regulatory problems that we're facing. And there are precedents in the systems. I mean, there's some of the work of the TBT that I think Ho mentioned, which looked at good regulatory practices, maybe serve as inspiration. Think about the reference paper on services telecommunications. So I think there's a value in exploring non-traditional types of outcomes in the WTO, and not always think about the traditional binding market access elements. And I think the TESSD and these initiatives really provide a useful space to design those principles and those good practices by involving different sectors and stakeholders. So I think that's probably the most promising avenue for the WTO to make a contribution in this area. Thank you.
No, super. That's extremely helpful. I was making sure I tried to take notes, because Carolina, I wanted to turn to you next and see what you thought of that to-do list, I guess, for the WTO. So I wanted to make sure I could summarize it for you, at least as I had it. The first point was keep the circular economy concept on the agenda. And I think, Christoph, you've already succeeded. I have the informal dialogue on plastics statement here. And there is at least a point, yes, I reached for it. And there's at least a point here that says, well, specifically in the context of trade-related capacity building and technical assistance needs to support developing countries' efforts to move towards more circular plastics economies. That's the first sub-point. So it's clearly on the agenda, so well done, even before the report is formally launched. But I think the other 4 points were keeping stakeholders engaged in domestic regulation, very well engaged and thinking about the trade implications of what they do. So focusing not just on trade policy, but on all of the other areas of regulation that are relevant. But the very specific WTO ideas, I think, were including the concept of circular economy in a potential revival of negotiations on improving access to environmental goods and services. Fascinating idea, reviving the initiative most of us had forgotten about remanufactured goods, which was in fact a topic of discussion, you remind us, 10 years ago in the WTO, maybe giving that a new lease of life. And the third, this really interesting one of using the existing sort of semi-formal, semi-informal discussions, the TESSD and the informal dialogue on plastics, to define a set of common principles or best practices, soft law instruments that governments might feel they can endorse and that might then gently shape their policies rather than trying to aim for a formal legally binding treaty. So Carolina, maybe I'll turn to you next for reactions to the other things you've heard, and maybe reactions in particular to those sort of 3 ideas for the WTO. What do you think?
Thank you. Very interesting, and obviously many points Mr. Bellon mentioned I'm very familiar with, because we are obviously dealing directly with the business. And I also kind of realize why the outcome, what you're saying, that sometimes the soft law actually works better. So obviously what we want when it comes to WTO, it would be good to have some kind of common agreement to reduce the tariffs, and in this way facilitate, I guess, the circular economy. But and then we also say that at the EU level, we support EU bilateral trade agreements where you should have the circular economy kind of inbuilt. But these may or may not be challenging. I mean, I know that there's 164, I guess it was 164 members in WTO, so we talk about a massive group of countries, and then, well, EU obviously easier, but 27 still challenging. What I thought I could give an example of, maybe on the soft law type of thing, because even though we say that we should include the circular economy to trade agreements, the negotiations, bilateral negotiations with EU to the third countries, it's a challenge. So I think at the same time we have to take the other route, and that could be the other kind of cooperation. And actually there's an interesting example concerning India. The trade negotiations between EU and India actually stopped or suspended in 2013, but they have restarted. But in the meanwhile, 2017, the EU started something called the Resource Efficiency Initiative with India, and that was for the same reason as why we are doing it here: the unsustainable use of natural resources, simply. And there they actually tried. I mean, the EU supported India to implement the UN Global Sustainable Consumption and Production Agenda, and they focused on certain specific industry sectors or sectors such as e-waste, plastics, and construction. And the point was that at the same time they raised awareness. Obviously, I mean, you still need to do it in the EU countries, but they raised the awareness of the need for the resource efficiency in India. But then they also facilitated partnerships and networking between European and Indian companies, because it has been mentioned here a few times, must be the private sector that kind of, is engaged, because they will create the business models and push and pull people to take on board the recycled products, for example, or understand why it's needed. So this was some kind of success and also welcomed, maybe because it wasn't so formal. So I just wanted to, or it wasn't linked to specific agreements, but it was definitely something that both parties saw as a win-win cooperation. So I just wanted to mention this as a good example. So I think all the proposals or the points that Mr. Bellman mentioned are certainly kind of together supporting the that we can go forward with the circular economy goals. So that's what I wanted to kind of elaborate with an example.
No, super, Carolina. That's really helpful. I might next perhaps turn to you, Besawit, partly with a sort of a question about what you think, particularly kind of trade-related assistance, the role that trade-related assistance specifically could play in helping developing countries to move towards more circular production systems. But I wondered if I might also put perhaps Holim and maybe Carolina and even Christoph as well on notice that there's a really interesting question in the Q&A box. If you haven't already seen it, have a quick look, because it's essentially about how government, and maybe it's trade related, but broadly, how government policy might be able to help manage the shift from the kinds of, essentially from the kinds of job, to manage the shift, to put it succinctly, from that is going to happen in kinds of employment as the circular economy transition happens. So have a quick look at the question so you can think up some responses. But Besawit, I might turn to you first, and just to get a sense, if developed countries were looking to use specifically aid-related trade-related development assistance to help developing country governments and the private sector to adopt more, or to come on board with more circular economy systems. What sorts of development cooperation could you potentially envisage that would be helpful? Is it about sort of aligning support for exports with a more circular concept? Is it about improving investment or changing the way that investment policy works and trying to make that more circular? Are there particular things you can think of that might be useful? Essentially, I'm looking for inputs for a sort of a WTO development-focused aid for trade kind of agenda. If we wanted to make that more circular, or to help developing country governments and the private sector through this circular economy transition, what sort of things do you think would be most helpful? I know that's a long-winded question, but I hope it's clear enough.
Yes, it is clear actually.
Okay.
Looking at what is happening currently, the discussions taking place in this sector, the first thing that comes to my mind is a very interesting discussion which is taking place between European Union and African Union to co-convene an event, Africa AU Business Forum. And then there is another regional forum called African Business Forum, which is also taking place parallelly. Those were supposed to be taking place this year, but unfortunately due to COVID, it has to be postponed to next year. But in any case, the discussions taking place in that panel, in those platforms, is how to engage the private sectors within the two continents to take lessons, best practices. How can the products being produced in one continent be still relevant as a circular product in the other one? How do we measure the circularity of the products produced? The metrics is not yet clarified, but the kind of coming up with harmonized standards can actually support this kind of possible trade transactions that would take in the future. One thing which is considered to be circular in one product which is circular in Europe might not be circular here, and vice versa also. So having a harmonized metrics would help to make the credibility or the product viable in the other side, I would say. The other one is having a common vision. A lot of African countries are still are trying to mainstream circularity and develop roadmaps individually, collectively as an African Union platform. But at the end of the day, still that gap is not there yet. But in the European context, I would say almost 99% of it is finalized. So when we go there to negotiate and trade, saying that this is our roadmap that we're following up, it has to be somehow be a good thing to negotiate, at least let alone written agreement. So that kind of collaboration would also bring impact on the ground, I would say. When it comes to partnerships and bilateral development approach, obviously the era of direct donations and something which is not bringing a win-win situation for both parties is no longer working. So basically, developing business models and market systems which embrace circularity can actually bring impact also on the ground. By impact, I mean developing programs and support partnerships and establishing coalitions which will bring a business model on the ground. Embracing circularity can actually bring a difference also, because whatever passes through that system at the end of the day be profitable for both ends, I would say. That's what I can reflect. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Reflecting back, sorry, yeah. Continue. Reflecting back on your question previously, AFCA is not yet on the ground. Basically, every African country should develop their national roadmap, not yet on the ground. But what is happening, an interesting thing happening on the ground, is sharing best practices. A lot of initiatives and scoping studies and mapping activities and the circular projects across the continent are taking place. and that kind of inspires others also to embark. So that kind of technology transfer, best practice exchange, and even to some extent, financial support from one country to another one is also taking place. So that is happening with the Free Continental Trade Agreement. Thank you. Back to you.
No, that's super, really insightful, Bezawit. Thank you, because I think it's probably something I could imagine fits really nicely into the concept of sort of aid for trade generally, but also sort of modern approaches to overseas development assistance. That it's about helping each country, its private sector and its public sector, achieve what that country wants to achieve, right? So if it's a homegrown concept of circular economy and it's one that the business community buys into, you know, that's a really useful sort of fertile ground where support might be needed. And the fact that that's already happening, albeit unevenly, is really interesting and a really good sign. Yeah, super. No, that's really helpful. I might perhaps, and I'm conscious of time. I see only one question, the really good one on the labour transition in the question and answer box. But I might at this point then maybe ask each of our panelists, maybe starting with you, Ho Lim, to respond, react to some of the things that you've heard in the discussion so far. And if you have any thoughts on how governments might help themselves, each other, help their private and their public sectors and their people to manage the labour transition that a circular economy transition would involve, that would be really interesting. Go ahead, Ho Lim.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. You know, lots of very good comments and ideas really put forward. Maybe just one sort of elaboration. I think when we talk about soft law versus hard law, I don't think it's necessarily quite as stark as that. And I think we can be a little bit more creative, because if we look at, say, the services domestic regulation negotiations, which just concluded, you have an interesting model there, because you've got the actual declaration of what these countries members have agreed to do, but it doesn't come into force in any way. It has no real impact until you put it into your schedules. This is the services schedules. So it becomes binding when you put it in your schedules. But you have the template, you have all of these things that should be done. If you don't take it and you don't put it into your schedules, you could call it soft law, so to speak. If you put it into your schedules, it becomes, well, hard law. And it's similar to the services reference paper that Christoph mentioned in telecoms. The reference paper itself is essentially, you could call it a set of guidelines. There are things that you should be doing as telecoms regulator, so-called soft law, but then it becomes something if you decide to put it into your schedule. And there you can even take further elaborations on it as you wish. So quite flexible. So I think my simple point is that let's build it first, or negotiate it first, or have the members do it. Don't get too fixated on the binding nature or non-binding nature of what this instrument is. Work on the substance. What actually would make a difference? What do you need in such a regulatory template that is supportive of regulatory cooperation for circular economy? Well, what are the 10 things that need to be done, or 10 principles? Because I don't think that discussions really happen. I mean, you know, if we can drill down to say, what are the 10 things that can help? Put that in a piece of paper, leave it a little bit open as to how you're going to take it on board, whether it's binding commitments, non-binding commitments, whatever it is. All too often I see, and I hope people don't take me wrongly, it's not criticism, but it's just how things are, that in a negotiation, people get very fixated on the legality of what we're doing, but they don't really address what is the substance, what is it that we should be negotiating. If that could be defined, I think would help greatly. And I think all the suggestions given give a lot of food for thought for doing something like this. Then the last one on the labor market, I think is a critical question. My only point here is just to say that it's not necessarily a new question to just circular economy. It's a question that we see all the time. This adjustment that is required as a result of changes in the economy. And I wouldn't pin it down exactly just on trade. It is about changes in the economy. And those changes in the economy come as a result often through technology. It's not the only factor, but technology does a lot in changing the nature of the labor market. Just take a very simple example. When we used to be able to fly, when you go to the airport, there would be tons of people at check-in counters servicing your check-in processes. Today, there's tons of machines. That's a result of a technological change that has displaced workers. So I think, yes, trade can play a role, but we also need to think about other instruments. And the main one for government is adjustment policies. How do you bring in adjustment policies to deal with adjustments to the labor markets due to technology, or in this case, the question was trade. But I think one has to be looking at this from a whole of government approach and not just through the trade agreement lens. So that's some thoughts.
No, super hopeful, Holim. Well, I confess that as a lawyer, I tend to be one of those who obsesses around how binding something is or is not. So maybe that's a weakness I need to get over. But maybe, Christoph, I'll turn to you next, and then to you, Carolina. Reactions, thoughts, responses to the fantastic question in the Q&A box, if you can.
Yes. Yeah. Well, let me start by maybe just reacting to what Holim just said. I think he's right on this idea of is it binding, is it not binding? I think that there's the whole scope or lots of nuances of gray, or nuances of soft law that can be explored. And I think what would be really interesting is to focus on the substance. Similarly, whether this is being discussed in the TESSD or in the CTE or anywhere else, I think it's of course up to the members. The more, if you do it in the CTE, you have a broader participation, and then that's always preferable. If you do it in the TESSD, it might be a bit more flexible, and it might easier to involve a broader range of stakeholders. You can pursue it in different. So that's not really the issue. I think that what really would be interesting is to focus on the principles and on the ideas. And maybe just to give you one example of a kind of principle that could be there is. One of the things we found, for example, in talking to different companies, is that there exists a lot of technological solutions. For example, there was a company, I think in Sweden, that has a system to extract phosphorus out of sewage sludge, or that can recover ammonium from wastewater, or that can recycle or generate salt from household waste. But all of these technological solutions cannot be put in place and traded internationally, because standards are often based on the origin of the material and not the quality. So because the origin is waste, you cannot trade it. And if you had a principle that says, base your standards on the quality of the product and not the origin of where it's coming, that would really help address this type of concern. So just to illustrate an example of what the type of principles and good practices that one can think of, and which is very specific to the circular economy. On the job question, that's an interesting question. Of course, these simulations about how many jobs are lost and how many jobs are created is, one always has to look at it with a grain of salt. But I think what is maybe more important than the number of jobs is to look also at the types of jobs and the quality of jobs that will be created. And there are concerns that some of these jobs might not be very high-paying jobs, might not be of the types of the quality that you might want to see. On the other hand, there are opportunities for also a lot of the jobs, for example, in developing countries, in collecting waste, are really from the informal sector. So I think there's also a whole discussion about how you can formalize these jobs and what can be done in this area. So to me, more than the number of jobs itself, which at the end of the day it's about adjustments and so on and so forth, it's really to look also at the quality and the qualitative aspects.
No, super, that's really helpful. And in fact, when you think about it, the fact that the classification of a good depends on its origin is in fact kind of the exact symptom of why that system is designed based on a linear production pattern, right? Like it can't quite accept, it can't contemplate the idea that something might be essentially the same as a new raw material, even if it used to be waste, right? The circular element of it, the return to the beginning of the value chain, just doesn't somehow fit into the way that HS classifications work. That's useful, thank you. Okay, I might turn to you next, Carolina. And if you had views on this question of the transition of the employment market and maybe the role of education in not only in in retraining people, but in preparing a new workforce for an economy where jobs change constantly, that would be really interesting. I know I'm taking you rather outside trade policy, but taking advantage of the fact that we have you here, if you had thoughts, I'd be really interested in hearing them.
Thank you. Actually, you're not taking me to an uncomfortable zone, because Confederation of Finnish Industry is an employer organization. So actually skills is one of the topics that we are very, 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 very interested in. What Mr. Ho Lim said about the change of the labor market is so correct, because indeed that's happening all the time. It's happening as new things develop. I worked for the telecom sector, and we used to talk about the morning organization and afternoon organization because everything changed so quickly. And then I wanted to comment also about the quality of the jobs, because first of all, in Finland, we have already started all kinds of new circular economy programs in the schools, universities, high schools. And when we think about the, for example, the textile sector as an example, they have created new innovations, how they turn textile waste into fiber. So this actually requires, high skills and a skilled workforce. Of course, in the whole chain, you have certainly, different kind of employees, but you need all kinds of skills and knowledge in the whole process. So we are responding to this by actually educating young people to get them already on board early on. So we are going to the schools and discussing the circular economy opportunities as it comes to how different industry sectors can employ in the circular economy point of view. And as I said, there are already programs in the different schools in Finland, addressing this and educating this. Addressing the challenge that we need to educate the youth to take on board the circular economy, the sector in a way. So I think this is we have kind of woken up to this, and we see it as a great opportunity. And we need new innovations. So then you actually need quite high skills for that too. Thank you.
Super. No, thank you. That's really interesting.
Sorry, can I just add one more
thing? Go ahead.
Yeah,
sure.
I forgot. At the EU level, there's already a project also to, well, the Commission already mapped the digital skills, what kind of skills we need in a digital sector. We talk about the digital and green transformation. So now they're doing it to the green area, and it's ongoing. So I'm just wanted to say that it's kind of happening already. We are trying to map out at the national and also EU level the new skills needed in the new world.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you for adding that in. Bezoit, your perspective. You can react to anything you've heard, but if you had perspective specifically on the education side of things, that would be really interesting.
I would be very much interested to reflect on the last part of the discussion, honestly.
Do.
My previous job, I was in charge of making sure that the factory sectors are installed with modern machineries and all the gadgets and the required material to make them as automated as possible. But the first person to react to that arrangement was the factory manager. So Beza, when we automate the whole process, don't forget that we will be losing the most important person in the room, the workers. So when it comes to circularity, what is the most important thing that comes to picture? I saw the figures of jobs lost and jobs possibly created. It doesn't really balance, but the point is circularity fosters entrepreneurship and innovation, especially in a country or in a continent where you have more unemployed youth with knowledge, with the energy, with all the expertise at hand, but don't have the job access. That is what you need most, and that's, in my view, the most important thing that circularity would bring to the continent of Africa. Most youth, fresh graduates would use that opportunity. That is one. And the last point I would like to reflect on is there are two ways to influence policymakers and decision makers, whether they are designers or government officials. We can go from the other side. The trade is a good thing. The income generation, the wealth creation is good. But again, it brings to the point that they also want to make sure that the social cohesion is intact. And unemployment creates a disruption, and circularity can create a bridge or a solution, a possible solution for them to stabilize their respective nations, I would say. Those are the 2 points I wanted to reflect. It just struck my mind. I'm like, trade is not trade, but it has more on the other sides of circular pillars. Thank you for the opportunity again.
No, well, thank you, Bezoit, for the insights. It's super helpful and really useful to hear. And I'm reminded a little bit of what the WTO's Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, says a lot, which is trade is about people. At the end of the day, we're talking about companies run by people, which employ people, and it's about people's quality of living and the labor standards they have. It's about all of that, as well as the natural environment, which of course people rely on as well. So thank you. That's super useful and a great anecdote to start with. I've been reminded on the question of circularity and how the concept of circularity can be embedded in the education system. The Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra has actually published a really useful set of articles recently, essentially specifically on how to make the circular economy part of a national education system. So there's examples in those articles about how Finland managed it. So those of you interested in that aspect of the circularization of economies, please have a look at Sitra's website, because there's some useful resources there. We've come, I think, almost to the very end, so it's probably for me just to offer a few kind of general concluding remarks. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I really, despite the fact that the Mission of Finland may have run 6 of these already, I learn something every single time we hold one of these webinars. So there's clearly a lot to keep reminding ourselves of, and to kind of keep pushing our thinking a bit. And I think we've come up with quite a useful list of potential to-dos for the WTO and for its members. Everything from going a bit kind of back to the future in reinvigorating or restoring some discussions that we had around remanufactured goods. So thanks for the reminder of that, Christoph. Also the idea of bringing back discussion about trade and environmental services. This is something I know a lot of members are interested in. I'm reminded also that there's a global review of the WTO's aid for trade system. So thinking about how development aid focused on trade can best be structured. There's another global review of the aid for trade system next year, 2022. And I think Bezawitt's given us some really useful input on how sort of aid for trade and official overseas development assistance can take circularity and perhaps kind of homegrown circular economy initiatives into account as developed countries and others seek to support developing country governments in moving along the path. A fascinating discussion about, well, essentially sort of about the actual barriers that private sector businesses and those working in them actually face. So we're all really looking forward to the ICC's report when it's out on Monday, to actually get a sense of what sorts of regulations we're looking at, and to be reminded, I suppose, of the huge potential for a bit more harmonization, including in really developed markets like the EU's, to ensure that material can be moved, material can be recycled or remanufactured at scale, right? Which actually enables a bigger transition to a more circular economy. We have, I think, some really interesting opportunities in these new initiatives, the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions and the informal dialogue on plastics, and which already, as we saw, include a number of interesting references to the circular economy. So it's clearly on the agenda. It's a question of where we take it next, I think, at the WTO. And I think we've had, some really interesting discussions, perhaps just at the end, about the fact that this is quite a significant transition for governments and for economies to be considering. It's clear that the circular economy provides tools for sustainable growth. It provides opportunities for businesses to help them tackle climate change and reduce the pollution they use, reduce the pollution they produce, but also to reduce the natural resources that they require for their production. But it was also clear just how much our current trade policy is sort of premised on a linear model, right? And Christoph's example of how difficult it is to convince a customs official that something that was waste is no longer waste, I think is kind of the perfect example of that. So that's really interesting. There's a lot of work clearly for us in the trade world to do. And it's clear, I think, that there's also a lot of thinking left to be done about how the circular economy can contribute to broader problems. There's a lot of work already on climate change, but I'm reminded also that the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra is going to be publishing a study on the role of a circular economy in halting global biodiversity loss. So there's clearly a lot of work going on specifically in Finland, in and around Finland on this. And ISD itself has also done a lot of work on the circular economy, and in fact on the impact that circularization can have precisely on jobs, right? Bringing in this concept of a just transition for workers involved in all business processes that are likely to change. So with that rather long-winded summary, I hope I've covered at least what I thought was most interesting from this hour and a half. So I hope it's reflected what you thought was interesting too. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining us. A special thanks to all of our speakers, to Carolina, to Christoph, to Holim, to Bezawitt, and a huge thanks to Marit Keitanen, who is sitting in the background, but who put all of this together. So a huge thanks to all of you for joining, and do have an enjoyable rest of your afternoon or the rest of your day if you're joining us from the morning. Thank you. Bye-bye.